Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this very important discussion of Russia's war crimes. For almost a decade, Russia has been committing war crimes in Ukraine and Syria, and to date, they have not been held accountable. This discussion will focus on the tools available to hold the Russian regime, military officials, and Russia's mercenaries accountable now and not decades from now. And also, we will discuss the similarities and tactics Russia uses in Ukraine and Syria. With that, we have an amazing panelist with a wealth of knowledge to discuss these issues. But first, I am Olga Lautman, a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and a coordinator for the Syria-Ukraine Network, and will be moderating this event. With us, we have Mouaz Moustafa, Executive Director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, Ambassador Stephen Rapp, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and a former U.S. ambassador at large for war crimes issues. Colonel Yevgeny Vindman, a director at the Military Analysis Prosecution Support Cell of the Atrocities Crimes Advisory Group, and a former deputy legal advisor at the National Security Council. And we might have Oleksandra Matviichuk joining us, who is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and head of the Center for Civil Liberties. But as we know, right now it's very difficult for people to join from Ukraine. So hopefully she will make it with us. She was scheduled. Before we start, Yevgeny, you are in Ukraine right now. Can you give us an update on what is happening on the ground?
Sure. Well, actually, it's quite a pleasant day here. Blue skies, no clouds, a little cold, but I've been here for a week. This is my 7th trip since June, and so I've traveled here almost monthly for the last 8-9 months. And the situation has changed pretty dramatically over the course of that time. Right now, my understanding is that there are no power issues. So the Ukrainians have been able to adapt to Russian attacks on power infrastructure, and that other than maybe localized losses, that the country is not suffering any power outages. There is a very difficult situation on the front line in Bakhmut. For those that monitor the situation, they're aware that the Russians are pressing hard, but the Ukrainians are holding. In other parts of the front, the Russians have attempted to attack and have sustained very serious losses. In fact, losses the likes of which they sustained at the very outset of the conflict. So the Russians do not appear to be making a great deal of headway in their war as far as attacks on Ukrainian territory, but that has not stopped them from attacking civilian targets. And so we've seen a campaign against civilian infrastructure, and that included power over recent months, included water treatment facilities and water. So these are the types of facilities that are necessary to sustain life. And it is the pattern of attacks indicates to me and others that are studying this issue an intentional attack, not on military targets that will provide a military advantage, but on civilians. And so it's quite a serious situation. By last count, there are over 71,000 open cases of war crimes, and it's going to take quite a long time to sort through that and prosecute and eventually hold those who are responsible accountable.
Thank you for the update. And Oleksandra Matviichuk was able to join us. And Oleksandra, over the past decade, Russia has committed countless war crimes in Ukraine and Syria. We hear the terms war crimes and genocide being used. Can you please tell our listeners the difference between war crimes and genocide? And also, to follow up, Russia has been kidnapping tens of thousands of Ukrainian children to ship them inside of Russia to basically reprogram them in re-education camps to, erase their Ukrainian heritage. Would that be considered genocide?
Thank you very much for providing me floor, and sorry for the noise in the background. My plane was delayed, so we just arrived. This war has a genocidal intent, and Putin clearly said that there is no Ukrainian nation, there is no Ukrainian language, there is no Ukrainian culture. And when Russian propagandists start interpreting this on different Russian channels, they told more openly that Ukrainians have to be either re-educated or killed. And when we speak about policy of forcible deportation of Ukrainian children and re-education them as special camps and then adoption of the Ukrainian children, it's also a part of the genocidal policy. Because when we speak about genocide as a crime, we have to prove the intent to partially or completely destroy some ethnic group. But in order to destroy some ethnic group, it's not obligatory to kill all this ethnic group. You have to change the identity of this ethnic group, and it's disappeared.
Thank you so much. I mean, this situation, I am very, very surprised there's not more coverage of this, because, I mean, this has been happening for the past year. And I just cannot even imagine. And the stories you hear of parents running into Russia trying to find their children. And, and then not only that, not only is Russia kidnapping the children, they're also using them as propaganda tools, as recently as last week when Putin gave his whatever that was, concert, I guess, and brought them on stage, making them hug military officials and, and Russian government officials. So, I mean, it's frankly outrageous. Ambassador Rapp, you've been involved in Syria since the uprising and have investigated countless crimes against humanity.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. We have an air raid siren here, so I may have to scoot in a few minutes, but I'm sorry if I drop off.
Oh, no, thank you so much. And that's the reality that Ukrainians are living with, that, they can't even have a peaceful hour. So you've been in Syria investigating crimes against humanity and war crimes by the Russian regime and the Assad regime. What mechanisms and jurisdictions are currently available to prosecute the Russian leadership and military officials? Also, in the past, we have had to wait a very, very long time to see these prosecutions and justice. Is there anything that can be done to expedite this, and what tools are available for the international community?
Well, Olga, that's a very broad question. First of all, I would like to point out the great relationship between Syria and Ukraine. It's been impunity in Syria that I think has been a message to Putin that he could get away with the massive crimes that he and his forces and his mercenaries are today committing in Ukraine. We know what he did in Syria in his intervention in 2015, but it was before that. It was the training and playbook of disappearance and torture and murder and custody, which Putin from his KGB days knows so well. And then, of course, in the intervention, it was flying the planes that bombed the hospitals, that made it more difficult, frankly, more dangerous to be a doctor or a humanitarian worker in Syria trying to help people than it was to be an ISIS terrorist, because they weren't aiming at those guys. They were aiming at the civilians that were supporting the hope of a better Syria and a democratic one. And then, of course, it was also flying operations in which the Syrians or perhaps the Russians were dropping chemical weapons in violation of all international law. So here in Ukraine, we have the same kind of crimes committed in the course of an international armed conflict that we haven't seen in this dimension since World War II. An invasion launched across the 2,000-kilometer border, massive civilian infrastructure destroyed, massive loss of life of civilians, and really a campaign which has thrown out the book in terms of the law of armed conflict and the ways in which wars are supposed to be fought under the Geneva Conventions. So, the relationship between the two is, and in Syria, we had a very challenging situation that, of course, we couldn't call on the Syrians to prosecute themselves. They weren't going to do that. They were behind it. I mean, I'm talking about the Syrian regime. And we didn't have an international court with jurisdiction. Any effort to provide one was blocked by Russia in the Security Council. And so we relied on prosecutions in third countries. Recently, the third Syrian regime figure was convicted in a German trial. There's a dozen other cases that are proceeding in various other countries. It's not enough, but it's something. But of course, we've got abundant evidence of the implication of the government and of the Russians. And I'd hope that potentially we could have a Russian accused brought forth in some of these Syrian trials, particularly some of those that are involved in bombing both in Syria and in Ukraine. As far as Ukraine is concerned, there we do have a national judicial system. Of course, it's under-resourced. It's at war. I know Evgeny Vindman's project is very close to working with those authorities to develop the cases under Ukrainian law. And some have gone forward already to convictions. Others are proceeding. Of course, the prosecutor general talks. I'm sure I can always just sort of add numbers. It was 65,000 when he was here a few weeks ago, and I'm sure it's 70,000 or more files in terms of war crimes. We also have the International Criminal Court, which does have jurisdiction in this case, unlike Syria, because Ukraine filed declarations placing itself under the ICC. But it can only do that for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. I should say that only, that's a lot. And so investigations are ongoing in The Hague. I think a potential case on the forcible deportation of children is one that we may see very soon. I think there's a potential of a case very soon against Putin for the war crimes specifically of attack on civilian infrastructure, the way in which he's attempted to punish the people of Ukraine for standing up to Russia, particularly since October with the attacks on the utilities, on heating and electricity, trying to essentially freeze people over the course of this winter. An effort in which he's been unsuccessful, but in which he's been attempting to terrorize the population in a way that has nothing at all to do with the military, what's happening on the front at Bakhmut or earlier in Kherson or elsewhere in the south. And so these are clearly war crimes, and I hope there can be charges brought, and there should be, by the ICC. I would note as well that there is a gap in the law when it comes to the crime of aggression. And what I think truly shocked the world about what happened in Ukraine in February of 2022, even though, of course, we know the Russian activities from 2014 forward, if not earlier, but was this massive invasion, people going to school and work and about their lives, and suddenly death is raining from the skies. And a total violation of the international norms that we established at Nuremberg, in which the Russians, the US, the Brits, and the French prosecuted the Nazi leader for this crime of crimes, a crime that actually it accumulates the evil of the whole, because it's not only the cases that are war crimes where you can show there's intentional attack of civilians or crimes against humanity, a widespread or civilian attack against the civilian population. Winning those cases can be challenging, but everyone in Ukraine has been a victim of the crime of aggression. The soldiers that have been called to fight and that are bleeding and dying in the trenches in Bakhmut, they're victims. The almost now $200 billion worth of infrastructure that's been destroyed, the homes, the properties, the businesses, the public facilities, all of that is a result of aggression. And that's why I think we need a court to do that too. And last week I sat in a people's tribunal in The Hague for a week. We heard 16 witnesses, a dozen from Ukraine, experts like Evgeny Vindman. Of course, also we heard from Oleksandra as a witness from Ukraine. We heard from General Wesley Clark, the former NATO commander, and in the end found that there was more than sufficient evidence to issue an indictment against Vladimir Putin for this crime of crimes, for the crime of aggression. And I'm hopeful now, with almost all European countries supporting it, that we can build the support to have a court that will try this crime as well. But these efforts continue. The key thing, as I know from the work I've done on Syria, is developing the solid evidence and the evidence also of the horrible things that the victims have experienced, but also to the maximum extent possible of the linkage evidence, the evidence linking the crime on the ground with the high-level individuals that made it happen.
Thank you so much for that. Yevgeny, you're still with us. Last May, the United States, in joint partnership with the European Union and United Kingdom, created the Atrocities Advisory Group. Can you tell us about this initiative and the work you're doing there? And also, what challenges are Ukrainians facing in documenting such a wholesale scale of war crimes and, frankly, genocide in many cases?
Sure. So the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group is a multinational group. The US, UK, and EU. Secretary Blinken announced it with the foreign ministers of the EU and UK back in May of last year. So we've been operating for under a year at this point. And it's the US government's program of record, but it's an interesting organization because it's supplanting a role that is typically filled by the United Nations or some other international body. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later, but because the UN is impotent to act, other countries have stepped in, and we're in an advisory role. So we do not personally collect evidence, but we stand shoulder to shoulder with our Ukrainian colleagues. We provide advice on what we see, whether it's out on a site, on a strike, for instance, on infrastructure, or whether it's an issue related to command responsibility, which is the issue that Ambassador Rapp just mentioned, that linkage of how you connect what happens on the ground, a particular strike or a series of strikes, a pattern to the senior leadership. And so our international experts from many different countries have come together to advise our Ukrainian allies. We're one of a number of different non-governmental organizations, but we enjoy official status. And in the IWG, in this group, one of the elements is this interinstitutional working group, which is an interesting body that the Prosecutor General has appointed, which has members of the Office of the Prosecutor General, so senior prosecutors, has retired Army officers, active duty military, investigators, all working together to put together evidence of war crimes. And one of the biggest problems is, frankly, the scope. And so, right now there are 71,000 cases. Well, there are not 71,000 prosecutors. In fact, there are many fewer than 71,000. And at the start of the war, some of them were actually mobilized and went to the front lines. So it's a scope issue. And there's also a bit of an expertise issue, because if you think about what these prosecutors have typically worked on, they've certainly tried their fair share of murder cases, sexual assaults, frauds, and things like that, sort of civilian crimes. But now you have the added element of military crimes, war crimes, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions that have a specific set of rules. It's lex specialis, which means it's a special area of the law that, frankly, unless you've been exposed to it, unless you practiced in that area, you may not understand all the nuances and rules. And so not every bomb that is dropped is necessarily a war crime. It may be part of a crime of aggression, which is something that Ambassador Rapp mentioned, but it's not necessarily a war crime. And so parsing out what are war crimes, and attacks on civilians are war crimes, civilian personnel or civilian objects, but not attacks on other uniformed military. So that's what we assist the Ukrainians with, and we try to do our best in a very difficult situation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the work you're doing there. Mouaz, first, we want to offer our condolences to the people of Syria and Turkey over this catastrophic earthquake. I know you and Ambassador Rapp have been working there endlessly, trying to distribute aid and assist in any way possible to the victims. It's such a large scale horror that I can't even imagine. So thank you so much for what you've been doing, and to Ambassador Rapp for his work and dedication to helping these victims. And you know, um so my question to you is, you've been oh, there are reports coming of Russia coming into Syria as early as 2012. I mean, there have been documentations of first Russia sending mercenaries and then Chechens into Syria, and officially they entered the war in 2015. Can you discuss the similarity in tactics Russia is using in Syria and Ukraine? Because I know once Syrians saw last year the mass scale of atrocities and the carpet bombing of buildings in Ukraine, I mean, they came like, to the aid of Ukrainians and wanted to do anything and everything to help them. So can you please discuss that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Olga. And thank you for your kind words. I think, with the earthquake, the situation has been horrendous in southern Turkey, but also in northwest Syria, where due to Russia and the Assad regime, there is no cross-border aid that came in for days and days and days post-earthquake. It's just different militaries and governments, have their rules of engagement and so on. When you look at how Russia operates, I mean, it's like the rules of engagement is to commit war crimes. It's really just shameless in that approach. And I also wanted to add that in this time post-earthquake, where millions of people are out on the streets, they've just been through this very traumatizing, the worst earthquake in Syria's history. The Russian military is still flying over northwest Syria, terrifying people and providing coverage and reconnaissance for the Assad regime, who has bombed these areas, at least by the Syrian Emergency Task Force, by our confirmed reports, at least 4 times by now, which is just, it's hard to fathom that someone is so evil to be able to do this. And so while Russia is terrifying the people that are, that have just suffered through the earthquake after suffering some of the worst war crimes of the 21st century under Russia, Iran, and Assad, it's important to remind people of that and how the Russian military has operated. To your point, yes, since 2011, 2012, the Russians were very much involved. They counted on Assad. They provided him, as Ambassador Rapp said a little bit earlier, too, a lot of the know-how on the processing of detainees and what to do with the bodies and how to, all of these things that if you go through and see the detention centers and the dungeons by the Assad regime, it's just some of the most sadistic, horrifying things ever. And a lot of that knowledge, a lot of that support and facilitation has come from Russia, not to mention the Wagner group, terrorist group, as far as we're concerned, that has come in thanks to Russia. And then you get to 2015 and you see Russia. We thought they were as involved as they can be, but then you see them coming in full force, where they were taking out entire neighborhoods. It wasn't just one residential building, it was entire neighborhoods. And where they sort of pursued the scorched earth policy, where the prioritized targets were civilians, residential areas, schools. They bombed our school. We have a school for orphans in Syria that they had targeted many times, killing some of the students and teachers, and then having forcing it to move elsewhere. When it came to hospitals, it came to a point where there was an effort actually to provide the United Nations with the hospital locations, an effort to be like, here, Russia, these places are hospitals, don't bomb them. Every one of those locations was targeted by Russia afterwards. And so what we're seeing in Ukraine, and I think you made this point earlier, is the impunity that Russia enjoyed in Syria and other places where the world just kind of looked away, allowed it to happen, letting Putin think that he can then go in and do the same. And if people allow these crimes to continue in Ukraine and don't stand wholeheartedly by Ukraine for a defeat of Russia and regaining their territory from Russia, another country will be the victim of all of this. You see the targeting of hospitals. You see the propaganda and misinformation that comes out about the civilians that are helping save each other, people like the White Helmets, Syrian American Medical Society, Syrian Emergency Task Force, etc. And then you see the result of these arbitrary detentions of hundreds of thousands of people, bombardment, which includes the mass graves that we're also seeing in Ukraine. And so it is just some of the most sadistic types of crimes. It shows the nature of the Russian military and its sort of tentacles, whether that's Wagner or others. And it's just been really, really horrific to see the playbook in Syria being repeated in Ukraine. And sort of it's something that I know the Syrian people have felt in such solidarity with Ukraine, because they're so similar, the crimes, that we see this as very much the very same war.
Thank you so much. And you touched on such an important point, that it's not just the war crimes that Russia is committing, but it's also the disinformation operations that then confuse the regular public of what is actually happening. And I mean, as Russia was assisting Assad in committing chemical weapon attacks on innocent civilians, at the same time, they were blaming the United States and the white helmets and others who were actually trying to save these civilians. And I mean, and we see exactly the same thing. I mean, it's been repeated in Ukraine since 2014. And we also see the same figures, shuffling back and forth between Syria and Ukraine and back to Syria and back to Ukraine. So, I mean, thank you so much for that. Oleksandra, you gave an interview last year in which you voiced concerns that you fear the world is looking away. Just last year, early fall, your organization documented more than 21,000 examples of war crimes committed by Russia's occupying forces since 2014. And a lot of them happened post February of last year. You said, quote, "I haven't any legal instrument to stop the Russian atrocities. No way of bringing perpetrators to court." End quote. Your organization has documented various war crimes, including the use of rape, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Can you discuss your findings and what suggestions do you have for the international community?
When large-scale invasion started, we united our efforts with dozens of organizations, mostly regional one, into Tribunal for Putin initiative. We have an ambitious goal to document each criminal episodes which was committed in the smallest village in each oblast in Ukraine. And for current moment, working together, we jointly documented 33,000 episodes of war crimes. And 30,000, it's a huge amount, but it's still a tip of iceberg. And I start to ask to myself, for whom do we document all these crimes for? Because national system is overloaded with an extreme amount of crimes. And International Criminal Court limits its investigation only to several selected cases. And as previous speaker mentions, they have no jurisdiction over the crime of aggression when we speak about Russian war against Ukraine. So who provide justice in this regard? This means that we have to fill this accountability gap, which has two dimensions. And the first dimension is that there is no international court who can prosecute Putin and top political leadership and high military command for this leadership crime, as a crime aggression is, for the initiating, planning, and starting the war of aggression. And in order to do it, we have to create special tribunal and hold them accountable. But we haven't limited our fight for justice only for crime of aggression, because we have another international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And in order to tackle these crimes effectively, we have to strengthen the ability of national system. And we, as the Ukrainian human rights defenders, see the way how to do it through the involving on the permanent basis the international element into the level of national investigation and national justice, like a model where national judges work together with international judges, national prosecutors work together with international prosecutors. It means that we have to create a hybrid mechanism which is integrated in national system and make it capable.
Thank you, Oleksandra. And one follow-up question. Since last year, have you seen, more countries willing to, find ways to prosecute Putin and his regime and every single military personnel and senior leader involved in these war crimes?
I see a positive trend. When we start to speak about it in May, and we try to convince the political leaderships of different countries that there is no reason to wait to the end of the war. The justice must be independent of the magnitude of Putin's regime's power. We cannot wait. We must launch all legal procedures now and hold Russian war criminals accountable. So then in May 2022, it sounds too radical, even among our close partner. But now we have a positive commitment of several countries. We got resolution of European Parliament. We got resolution of Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. And they all proclaim the idea that such kind of special tribunal on aggression has to be created. But the problem is that it's not enough to get consent of several countries, because it's very easy to imagine a situation when Russia created their own international tribunal. They invited Syria, Afghanistan, Cuba, Venezuela, some other kinds of regimes. And this will be a battle of international tribunals, which make the idea of justice turn into absurd. So we have to create a special tribunal in the frame of international organization, and the most priority is UN. And several days ago, I spoke in New York on the event devoted to the large-scale invasion, this sad anniversary, and then the General Assembly voted for resolution. And when I opened this resolution, I was really frustrated because this resolution didn't mention any word about special tribunal. They have a very abstract formulation about justice, nothing concrete.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Ambassador Rapp, we know that many of the Russian military officials, mercenaries, and military personnel operated in both Syria and Ukraine. Would collecting evidence of the war crimes in both countries and putting this evidence together be able to strengthen the cases against these individuals?
Very definitely, it would. And obviously, as these European countries in particular work on developing cases out of Syria and also trying to work as well on cases from Ukraine, the idea of finding individuals that are involved in, say, the Wagner Group or others that were involved in the attacks on hospitals or in the dropping of chemical weapons, the idea of having an individual charged in Europe right now for crime committed in Syria, but who's active in the current conflict is one of the ways, I think, to actually score a goal in a way for justice in both places. I do want to emphasize that third country prosecutions are important, and Ukraine, I think, offers the possibility of carrying this up a dimension. To a large extent, what we've had when it comes to Syria is countries looking at prosecuting individuals that have come to that country and that say came in the flow of refugees, pretending to be victims when they were in fact victimizers and hid out, and then were eventually discovered. And it's been possible to prosecute individuals like that, generally lower level persons, though we have recently a colonel. We hope to soon charge a general in Austria. There are others that are at a higher level, but of course this is a conflict that's gone on for 12 years and in which hundreds of thousands of people have moved to Europe. So our situation when it comes to Ukraine is not so rich when it comes to actually having some perpetrators in those countries, unless we're talking about oligarchs or economic groups, et cetera, where we may be able to prosecute them for aiding and abetting. And I think that's a useful thing to do. But countries, and Germany has already, should be declaring universal jurisdiction. Germany has said that they're impacted by the crimes in Ukraine. They're in fact providing medical care, for instance, to some children who were injured in an attack near Odessa. And so they're looking at prosecuting individuals that are still in Russia or still fighting in Ukraine in German courts, putting out international arrest warrants, basically saying this person is an enemy of all of humankind. Now, will they get that person arrested tomorrow? Well, maybe on the field of battle in Ukraine, and they could be extradited, depending on what the Ukrainians want to do first. But at least I think it's important to send that signal. I was in an event in The Hague about 4 weeks ago discussing the capacity that countries have all over the world to do these kind of cases, and particularly where their own nationals or dual nationals are affected. And we've got more than a dozen countries where dual nationals have been killed, including several Americans in Ukraine, that gives the United States jurisdiction to pursue murder cases. And now with the new war crime statute, we've got greater potential when people come to the United States, but we already have it where an American is the victim of that crime. So I think it's something that we need to look at. I'm excited to hear from Oleksandra about the support for also a hybrid approach to justice, and leaving aside the importance of having this special tribunal on Ukraine and believing, as she does, that we need a UN General Assembly resolution rather than with strong words, but with actual language that calls on the Secretary General to negotiate that. So we want to go forward on that leadership tribunal. But I think there is a need for this hybridized justice. I mean, the Ukrainian system is struggling. It's obviously being provided with assistance, but it's still operating in its own structures with local prosecutors in Kharkiv or elsewhere doing the cases, and a system where there are various police agencies that are developing the evidence. And it's very complicated. And the idea that we could have something to some extent like occurred in Bosnia, in which we have internationals that assist the domestic system in a special court or a hybrid court, or even a special division like the anti-corruption court that they have now, that would do a more concentrated, cases against individuals, particularly those that are most responsible for patterns of war crimes that are occurring in Ukraine. So that's another place where I think justice is important, and in which a variety of European countries and other countries can, I think, participate.
And by any chance, Ambassador Rapp, do you know if there is a collection of the personnel? Because I know, for instance, in Ukraine, we have the Mirotvorets site that documents, has a list of people who have served both in Syria and Chechnya and in Ukraine, and basically information. But is there an international system of collecting the personnel, like information on the military personnel and mercenaries that have served in both countries?
Well, I think it's important that be done. There is a joint investigative team, which includes Ukraine and 6 or 7 other countries, and the ICC, which has the benefit of Europol, which has its core in a project on international crimes and can use the latest in data technology. And I think it's important to build that kind of a framework. Those agencies don't tell you what they're doing until they actually produce the cases. But I really do think it's important to find these sort of cross these individuals, because they exist. I mean, certainly the Wagner Group active in both places. Recruitment by the Wagner Group in Syria. I don't know how many Syrian regime people went to become cannon fodder for the Wagner Group, but there are some. And some that have gone in with Kadyrov and the pro-Russian Chechens as well, that are famous for their assassinations and brutal acts, et cetera. So we need to develop, as you say, that database, and that's something that law enforcement should be doing. And then there should be people charged and wanted posters out there and grab these guys and bring them to justice and allow the victims and survivors to testify against them, and see that justice is something that can make progress even while the conflict is ongoing.
Thank you. And I have one more question for you. We know the Wagner mercenary group has been operating in both Syria and Ukraine. We know that they are leaving a trail of atrocities from Africa. They are propping up dictators across Africa. They operate in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Ukraine. And we know that they have been recruiting, training militants, and basically they are a terrorist organization. But the United States recently designated them as a transnational criminal organization, which frankly sounds like a mafia organization or a cartel. Why is it that the U.S. has not designated them as a foreign terrorist organization, despite them having the same exact tactics as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or other terrorist organizations on our list? And how important is it to have this designation?
Well, I think it's quite important, and it would provide additional tools to law enforcement. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, terrorism is a tactic. It doesn't come in one nationality or religious group, et cetera. It occurs sadly in the course of conflict. Groups that become known for seeking to win by acts of abominable terror and atrocity against innocent individuals, in the hope that by doing that they can frighten people into submission. And that's, of course, the kind of thing that we've seen from ISIS or ISIL and Daesh in the way that they've carried on the conflict in the Middle East and elsewhere. As they fight for their cause, but do it by horribly brutal acts against men, women, and children. And of course, those are atrocity crimes under the laws of war. They're crimes against humanity, but they're also the use of terror. And here in the Wagner Group, as we've seen documented, leaving aside Ukraine for a moment, but obviously in Africa, where I really began my work in international justice at the Rwanda and Sierra Leone tribunals as prosecutor, there we're seeing horrendous crimes being committed against civilian populations, children, being taken and being essentially enslaved as soldiers, or families intimidated or threatened unless if they raise any sort of issues about this. Campaigns of rape and sexual slavery, and it is occurring in Mali and in Cameroon and elsewhere, in Central African Republic in particular. And this certainly is something more than, I mean, we know the horrors committed by transnational organized crime, by the mafia, by various drug cartels, et cetera. But here we've got these people that aren't shooting just at their enemies in gangland. They're taking it out against the whole civilian population. And so, if the shoe fits, wear it. And I think it'd be appropriate to designate them as such. We've designated various militia in the Congo as terrorist organizations in the past, those associated with the Rwanda genocide. And I think we could do it here. And that does provide us a really effective hammer that when groups then work with the Wagner Group or sign deals with them or provide them with intelligence or information or funding or benefit by their trade in conflict minerals, which is, of course, what Wagner is all about. It's gaining control of assets and money. When people are involved that way, then they become immediately people that are providing material support to a terrorist organization. And you can prosecute them for that without actually having to implicate them in the crime at the ground level. And that's the kind of effective tool that makes it very hard for ISIS, for instance, to finance itself. And so I think this is the kind of thing that we need to do. And this, if we don't, this organization is going to continue to spread its tentacles, and corrupt regimes are going to buy into it for a share of the loot that Wagner gets. And we're going to have further problems. So it's Ukraine. Certainly, they're providing, obviously, some of the most brutal soldiers that are going in there at the front and in the conflict. But it's everywhere that we're concerned, and that makes them, I think, a fitting target to be a designated terrorist organization.
Thank you. And just to add to what you said, they are also not only propping up dictators across Africa, but also training their military in exchange for siphoning the resources of the countries. And we see this in South Sudan with, the siphoning of gold. And I mean, what they're doing, I absolutely agree with you. Thank you so much for that. Colonel Vindman, last year you wrote an article on the need for the creation of a successor to the UN or a modified UN. You said, quote, "It must be an organization where one nation cannot escape accountability because it is in a special class. Tyrants and despots are watching this war and will learn what they can get away with," end quote. Can you discuss this further, please?
Sure. So we're involved in this situation now, and I think we've heard from a number of my colleagues how Russia is playing a destabilizing force. They are a major destabilizing force in Africa. They've acted with impunity in Syria and then prevented any accountability with their veto. In fact, they're probably one of the most disruptive forces in the world today, and so they're wielding their veto in such a way as to make them they have personal impunity. And if you think about history, and there was a precursor to the United Nations, and that was the League of Nations, and the League of Nations failed because in the late 30s. Italy had attacked aggressively another country, Ethiopia, just to seize their territory. And so the League of Nations was formed after World War I to prevent aggressive war. But nations failed to act. And within literally years, we had World War II. And now we're in a situation where a country has, for the first time in almost 80 years, a major war in Europe attacked a neighbor, a free democracy, in order to reestablish an empire. And it's the first in, well, it's actually not the first in a line of dominoes, because if you think about Georgia, that was in 2008. The initial attack on our Ukraine was in 2014. And they've been fighting a hybrid war since. And so it's, I guess, another in a long line of dominoes. There's mischief afoot in Moldova, where there's appeared to be, first of all, disinformation, but Russian-funded separatists that are attempting to rile up or topple a democratic government there. So what Vladimir Putin is attempting to do is rebuild a Russian empire, and the UN currently is powerless. There have been at least two very good General Assembly resolutions where the vast majority of countries have condemned Russia, but the veto is really the most important element of the UN Security Council, and it's the body that's is created to maintain international peace. And the structure is totally failed in that regard. One country wielding a veto has stopped any accountability. And what my article basically discussed is the need to prevent such impunity by one nation, whether it's the UN or it's a successor. Something needs to change, because the rules-based international order that's been in place is under significant threat. And if we fail now, we can anticipate other countries learning this lesson, other aggressive countries learning this lesson. And with the advent of nuclear weapons since World War II, the world has become a much more dangerous place.
Thank you, and I totally agree. Mouaz, over the past 12 years since the Syrian uprising, besides Russia, Iran, and the IRGC has played a critical role in brutally suppressing protests, committing mass atrocities against civilians. I mean, we've seen the mass graves, and we've seen, all the photos of torture, and I mean, it's inhumane, it's war crimes. And we've seen that they've been Iran has been sending operatives to assist Assad inside of regime over the past decade. And so last year, there were reports of Iranian, Islamic Revolutionary Guard for militants in Crimea. And we know that Iran has been supplying Russia with drones and other weapons in order, to help them, in the full-scale invasion against Ukraine. Also, CIA Burns last year gave a warning last December and told PBS that Quote, what's beginning to emerge is at least the beginnings of a full-fledged defense partnership between Russia and Iran, with the Iranians supplying drones to the Russians, which are killing Ukrainian civilians as we speak today. And then he added, quote, the Russians are beginning to look at ways in which technologically or technically they can support the Iranians, which poses real threats to Iran's own neighborhood, to many of our friends and partners in Iran's neighborhood as well. Can you discuss the implications of this partnership for Syria, and what do you expect Iran to do in Ukraine, and what warnings do you have for Ukrainians based on what Iran has done inside of Syria?
Well, Iran's role in the region as a whole has been horrific. It is, one can only just look at the voting on that resolution, condemning the invasion. You'll see the few countries that didn't, that voted no or whatever, whether it's Belarus, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran, and you don't have to be at the CIA to see, by the way, this sort of merger of interests and also horrific actions that have happened. I mean, if you look at Syria, what Iran has done, at one point, General McMaster, who was former national security advisor, mentioned that Iran's ground troops, Iran actually made up about 80% of the ground troops of the Assad regime. Imagine, these are all people not from Syria. There's absolutely no popular support whatsoever for Iran, IRGC in these militias in Syria. Yet Iran has brought, Afghani militias like Fatemiyun and Zainabiyun that recently, by the way, 3 days into the earthquake, committed a horrific massacre where they slaughtered over 50 people and kidnapped women and children, and just horrible. They have brought Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, which has committed horrific crimes. And by the way, because of the impunity, because allowing Hezbollah to go in there and do whatever it wants alongside the Russians, Hezbollah has now become a juggernaut that's even more dangerous due to its experience in Syria for the entire region. You see the Iranian-backed militias that have come in as well, that have committed horrible crimes in Iraq. They're doing the same in Syria, and you can talk to some of our staff members on the team. Omar Al-Shugri, who is an amazing young man working with SETF. His entire village was slaughtered by Iranians and Iranian-backed militias working with the Assad regime, of course, under the cover of Russia. And they didn't even leave a plant or an animal or a pregnant woman or anything that you would think maybe can be spared from this hell. So really, just horrific genocidal massacres that Iran has committed alongside Russia and the Assad regime. And then you see in Ukraine what is unfortunately not surprising, whether it comes to the drones and the suicide drones and the other types of drones that Iran has provided Russia, which again, a lot of these weapons are weapons, again, not used mostly against military targets. Most of the time they're used against civilians and civilian infrastructure. You also see the reports of IRGC and Iranian operatives on the ground in Crimea. We saw that in Syria. And I wouldn't be surprised, in the coming time, if we don't put a stop to this, if we're not able to really stop this criminal partnership between Iran and Russia, to see other horrific militias, some of the same ones that committed horrific genocidal massacres in Syria, doing the same there. Iran, of course, well aware of the chemical weapons use, well aware of the mass graves. There's one mass grave site in southern Damascus. There's a lot of Iranian checkpoints in Syria around that place. They know that that's where the regime processes all the people that it's arrested and killed. But then they also kill arbitrarily anyone that walks up to the checkpoint. If you look at them wrong, then that's good enough to be killed and then thrown at the gate of that mass grave. So what Iran is doing in Ukraine now is a microcosm of what it's been doing in Syria. And the fear is that it will sort of continue these activities, including provide manpower in addition to the weapons and so on. Not to mention, of course, their aid diplomatically, politically, and on the misinformation front. Iran is essentially a satellite of Russia when it comes to that propaganda as well.
And to follow up on that, Mouaz, have you seen Iran being in any way slightly weakened with the protest? And do you see Russia attempting to prop up the Iranian regime inside by sending any special forces? Not that they really have that much right now to volunteer, but do you see any kind of collaboration in brutally quelling the protest inside of Iran? Because I mean, it's really unfortunate because I haven't seen coverage in Western media, but I mean, the executions are still taking place on a weekly basis. So can you fill us in on?
So I first of all, I mean, Russia will go to all lengths, I think, to support even the worst types of dictators. We look at what it's doing for the Assad regime, what it's doing for the Iranian regime, the political and diplomatic, and if you look at their, RT or their different, social media and satellite channels and stuff, it's definitely there to push a very different narrative from what the Iranian people are seeking in terms of their freedom and democracy. Absolutely, Iran has been weakened by what's been happening in Iran by its own people that are demanding their own freedom, their own democracy, that don't want their country to be one that's out there killing and slaughtering Syrians or Ukrainians or doing any number of horrific crimes, through its network across the region. And Russia has been weakened by the Ukrainian people. I mean, these are allies in evil. There's no way around it. I'm not trying to be idealistic or cliche. They're purely evil in what they're pursuing, and they will do anything to prop each other up because they're all they've got. What's really important, though, is for the international community, led by the United States, to take a stronger stance on all these things. There's no reason for Wagner not to be designated as a terrorist organization, whether that comes through Congress or through administration. That has to happen. And Russia itself is a terrorist sponsoring nation. That's the sort of categorization it should have in the United States. But we need to do everything we can simultaneously, not just to support Ukraine to win their war, but to support the Syrians as well to defend themselves from the Russians and the Iranians, and to support the Iranian people on the ground to have their country back, because these governments by no means represent their populations. And so, I think you see Russia doing all it can to prop up its these horrific allies of it, and what we need to do is really do a lot more in terms of action, not just statements, because we've heard a lot of great stuff in support of the Iranian people. We've heard a lot of great stuff in support of the Syrian people. We've heard a lot of great stuff, and we've seen some action in terms of Ukraine, but more needs to be done simultaneously across all these front lines, because for the Iranian people, for a young woman or man in Iran or in Russia, or in Ukraine or in Syria, and frankly, even in Russia, they want the same values that we hold dearly in our democracies, and they deserve the actionable support, similar to how Russia and Iran support each other in killing civilians.
Thank you so much. Very important. Oleksandra, very quickly, how important is it for the United States to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism?
It's very important because we have to call the things what they are. I will remind you that Russia deliberately destroys civil infrastructure, and after the first success of counteroffensive action in Kharkiv region, it's become a deliberate Russian policy in order to deprive millions of Ukrainians of water, food, electricity, heating, internet connection during the winter. And it was clearly articulated that this is a goal. So Russia behaved like a terroristic state to push Ukraine to surrender through the enormous pain of civilians. And that's why it has to be called as they are. And I know that it's resulted in numerous legal consequences, which is ingrained in American legislation. And we're waiting for this and asking to do it as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. This concludes our discussion. And again, I want to thank our amazing panelists for the information they have provided, for the steps they have provided, for the international community to take in order to put an end to Russia's atrocities around the globe. And I want to thank the listeners who have joined us. Please don't forget to visit stipa.org for the latest events and some of the important international security issues analysis of it. Thank you so much for listening to us.